thou, O son of man, I have set thee a watchman unto the house of Israel. Therefore, thou shalt hear the word of my mouth, and warn them from me.
Have no fellowship with the unfruitful works of darkness, but rather expose them.
Coming to you from an undisclosed location in Middle Tennessee and examining current events from a biblical perspective, this is Bible News Radio with your hosts, Randall and Stacy Harp.
All right, hey everybody, I want to welcome you to today's episode of Bible News Radio. Yeah, it is. Hey, did you know that we're not really radio? If you're watching us, we're actually live streamers here on the internet, all over the internet, in fact. So if you happen to be watching us, I know it was on purpose. Yeah, I do. You weren't in your car just like scrolling through the radio dial trying to find us. And today, hey, I have to tell you, out of all the days for you to tune in, this is providential, people. Yeah, it is. It's almost distinctive of a mystery. I have a spammer calling. Yeah, I do. A mystery of biblical proportions that the whole world can know about. Yeah, it is. So, here's the deal. Here's what I want you to do. I know you guys are live. I'm going to log in here to Periscope. There you go, right there. And you guys, do me a favor, share this out. I know that you guys are super excited. I've been promoting this interview for a little bit. And I, personally, am super excited that I have my guest on the show today, because not only is he super great, but he's super great. Yeah, he is. And I mean that in the truest sense of the word, super. He's a superman of biblical proportions. Yeah, he is. He's written a book. He's written a number of books. One's called ColdCase Christianity. A homicide detective investigates the claims of the Gospels. Yep. And then the other one is called Forensic Faith. A homicide detective makes the case for a more reasonable, evidential Christian faith. And you know what? He also has some other books out that I don't have in my hands right now, but we're going to learn about those too. And so I just have to tell you that I am super excited to have J. Warner Wallace on the show to talk about biblical apologetics and fun stuff like that. He was in God's Not Dead too, you know, and I know I want to sing the song God's Not Dead. He's surely alive. Living on the inside, roaring like a lion. You know what I'm saying? Anyway, he also teaches at Biola University, which is one of my favorite Christian universities out there. And he is a contributor on Dateline and a whole bunch of other fun stuff. So I'm not even going to tell you anything else, because most of you guys already know who he is. I already had one of you say he's your Biola professor, so that's super cool that you already know who he is. So without further ado, people, for the whole hour, we have Jim with us. And just come on, let's get on the screen. Okay, here you are. Hello.
Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
Hey, I'm glad you're here. You know?
Yep, good to be here.
Well, this is, you know, I always tell people, it's always kind of challenging when you're a host, because, you know, most people don't realize, like, literally, this is the first time you're talking to the person.
Right.
Just,
yeah.
But
there's I think there's actually a lot of homework that has to be done before you can do this well. I get a chance to do a lot of radio. I sit in for Stand to Reason quite a bit, where I actually get to guest host. And it's not easy, right? It's not easy to figure out enough about somebody to be able to ask good questions that can, enlighten your people who are listening. You obviously know something about your listening group, but you don't always know something about the person you're interviewing. So I totally get it.
Right. Well, as I told you when I booked you finally, because you're a tough guy to book.
I'm always trying to squeeze in between. There's a lot you can do, from your house, as you know.
I know.
And so a lot of when you write a book, a lot of it is trying to get people to read it. And that's to me, my least favorite part, right? Because you obviously have these ideas and you want to be able to communicate the ideas well. But then once you do that, there's no guarantee anyone's going to read them. And if you thought this was worth writing, you probably want someone to read it. So you have to spend some time making sure that happens, for sure.
Well, I have to tell you, Dr. Frank Turek, 15 years ago, was my first guest.
Oh, very cool.
And the book I interviewed him about was his book, I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist.
Yeah.
And you don't know this, but that interview irritated me because it was literally my first interview, and he kept repeating the name of the book over and over, and I'm like, would you stop saying the name of the book? Well, 15 years later, I get it, right? You know, you mentioned
it's my least as a non-believer. I was always suspicious that Christians were really just trying to sell me something, and that was the motivation behind. Because this is always the case. The only motivations behind any behaviors are, and this is the case for me working a homicide, or this is the case for me examining any sin. It's always going to come down to financial greed, sexual lust, and the pursuit of power. So I'm always like listening to people and thinking, okay, which is it for this guy? It's one of these three that's driving this whole thing. I mean, the idea that you would do something selflessly, for me as a non-Christian, just didn't exist. I mean, if you're talking to me, it's for one of those three reasons. So I always was suspicious. And now, so I don't like the idea of having to market something. So what we try to do, and you're doing the same thing I am, everything I do online is free. I mean, I do all that stuff, all those articles, podcasts, videos, all that stuff. We offer that stuff. That's for nothing. And we kind of feel like, hey, we've got to make some contribution in which people can realize that this is not a money issue. And by the way, if you don't know anything about publishing, you quickly figure that out, because I think the number of people who actually read is shrinking. So that's why I'm doing more in terms of video than I've done before. And I'll probably have to increase that more. So where I first started, I was doing like 5 blogs a week, just 5 years ago. I would write every morning. I'd get up, I'd write something every morning, and I would post it. Now we're doing 2 articles, but we're doing 2 videos and 1 podcast, because things are shifting in different ways that people consume information. So yeah, I'm glad to be part of this.
Yeah, well, I'm honored. And you mentioned Stand to Reason earlier, and I have to tell you, Greg Kokel I consider him one of my very early Christian mentors in apologetics. Excellent. Because when I lived in Southern California, his show was on Sunday for 2 hours. Yes. Me and my husband religiously every Sunday afternoon we sat there with our Bible and our notebook. Yeah, and I became dangerous though. I was like, okay. Because one of the things he always talks about is how people assume what you believe without you even saying anything. And if you ask questions, they'll assume what you're going to say, and it's because they don't listen. And I found that to be very, very true, actually.
Yeah, that's one of the best contributions that Greg has made is the book Tactics. And so if anyone doesn't have that book, you ought to get it. I'm realizing now as I'm talking to you, I can straighten this camera a little bit. Let's do that. Okay, now I feel like I'm actually better. The ship is actually level now, so that's good.
Well, I always mention his book, Relativism, Feet Firmly Planted in Midair. Yeah. As well.
Great book.
So anyway, I just share that just so you know kind of my background. I kind of feel like a weird woman in a lot of ways, because I don't find a lot of women who study apologetics. I could be in the wrong area or business. I don't know. But I find it interesting that a lot of women don't dive into apologetics because they're scared of it. So what I want to do is I want to have you begin by telling us your story, how you came out of atheism, because as you know, there's a new atheism today, and I know you've been a believer for a while, but your background as a homicide detective actually is intriguing to me. Everybody loves to meet detectives. By the way, you kind of look like a detective, like a real one, And I saw your
That's because unfortunately I am a real one. So that's because how else can I look? I'm not quite sure how else I can look.
Well, I don't know. It's like you could be a TV star, Well, you kind of are.
Well, I can tell you the stuff that we talked about in God's Not Dead too is pretty much how I became a Christian. I mean, that's what was so great about that the writers of that movie are also the writers of Unplanned, which was a movie about abortion, which came out earlier this year. Chuck and Carrie wrote both the first and second movie in God's Not Dead, and they came out to see me at the Evangelical Theological Conference that was here in San Diego a number of years ago. And they were writing this story for the second movie, and they just really wanted to know, how could we make the case for the resurrection if we had to do it in a courtroom? Now, look, of course, a lot of these kinds of things we're talking about are fiction in terms of how you could get this in front of a jury. But they knew my story a little bit. So we sat down in a hotel room, and I just went through the case with them on PowerPoint, just worked through it with them. And ultimately they came back to me and said, hey, would you just be willing to come in and just do a scene in the movie where you just kind of cover that stuff again for us? So I was able to write the scene.
Oh, cool.
And I wrote it basically in my own experience. I just kind of took my own experience and encapsulated you're only going to have about 6 minutes to be able to do something like that. And so for me, it was that I was an adult in my 30s when I first bought my first Bible, looked at the words of Jesus, really analyzed them from the perspective of forensic statement analysis. I really didn't trust. I never trusted up to that point anything the Gospels told me, largely because I didn't trust anything supernatural. I was very much a committed natural. You don't go to a crime scene and think to yourself, okay, was it a human suspect here I'm looking for or a demon? No, we stay in the natural world in order to work those kinds of investigations. But I just got to the point where in reading through the Gospels and testing them the same way you would test any eyewitness account, I couldn't find ways to discredit them in the same way I might suggest to an attorney, here's how we can discredit this witness on the stand. So I really knew that I had to dig deeper and figure out where I stood on these important issues. Ultimately, that's why I became a Christian. It wasn't because I had a crisis moment or an epiphany or anything like that. It's just I took 6 months to work through the evidence for Christianity. And at the end of that, I was like, wow, it is the most reasonable inference from evidence. And so that's why I became a Christian. So that's really the thing that motivated me and has motivated me ever since. Now, I wasn't long after that I began serving in my local church. And probably within 3 or 4 years, I was enrolled in seminary. And I've ultimately got a seminary degree. And then I became a youth pastor and then a lead pastor. But that process was still in my mind about how I came to trust these to be true documents. And so I employed that as my role as a youth pastor ultimately. Now, look, a lot of that was just one train wreck after another because you make mistakes as a youth pastor. And so I tried to provide some of that wisdom in this book. Here's some areas where we've failed, because I think it can be overwhelming to write a book on practical ways to share the Christian worldview with the next generation. As a parent, I just hear that and I'm like, this book is just going to remind me of the 87 ways that I messed up, right? It's going to remind me of everything I'm not doing. So I think that part always is in the back of my mind. That's not what this book is. This is a book that will help you just to take 1 or 2 simple concepts out of that book, I think would change the way you interact with the next generation to share the Christian worldview. That's my hope anyway.
Amen. Well, personally, I just want to say thank you for that.
Well, the most encouraging thing we've done as a couple, Susie and I, has been to create the children's series. That all the adult books have a children's component. We have a website at casemakersacademy.com. That simple website is where you can go and actually jump into academy programs for 8 to 12-year-olds, where you learn how to make the case for Christianity, for God's existence, learn how to articulate the gospel. 3 different academies, and there's nothing better. I mean, adults will write to me occasionally and say, yeah, I read your book and I liked it. Great. I always want to hear that, right? Mm-hmm. But when you have a kid write to you and say, yeah, I earned a certificate at one of your academies, and then I took that certificate and here's what I did next week. I mean, that's nothing more encouraging than having young people write to you. And it kind of makes because I'll tell you, writing kids' books is much harder than writing adult books. Number one, the illustration to text ratio is about 50-50. So that means I know when I'm writing a kid's book that I'm going to have to do maybe 30 to 50 illustrations for that kid's book. And so that means I'm going to spend as much time illustrating as I am writing. And that makes it harder. But boy, it does pay off when somebody actually is using the book.
Yeah. Well, I think it's especially good. I mean, I teach Awana right now. But at my previous church, and I won't say which one it is in California, not to indict them, I tried to submit an apologetics curriculum to the pastor, who was a young man, who shot it down because he claimed that children couldn't learn apologetics. And I was dumbfounded by it, because I was like, you're kidding me, right? I mean, you started out as a youth pastor. Doesn't mean just because you don't have a college degree doesn't mean some kids aren't smarter than you.
Yeah, no.
But what do you?
This is not unusual. What you experience is so common.
I know.
I get this all the time from people. It's not just about kids, children's ministry. I mean, I get this all the time from people who say, my pastor's not interested in teaching apologetics to the adult congregation. Look, I know that one thing. I've been involved in one of the largest churches in America on staff. I've been involved in small churches, and I've actually done house churches for about 6 years after that.
That's cool.
Every form of church is both beautiful and ugly. I have no preference on form of church. I always tell people, whatever church you're part of, you might as well get over it, because if you don't think that family's perfect, well, guess what? No family is perfect. And if you want to remove all the knuckleheads in that church, that's going to probably include you. So be careful who you're trying to eliminate from. So I get it. Everyone's going to have a different approach to this. So without condemning pastors, I wrote Forensic Faith because I knew that before I could make the case for Christianity and the case for God's existence, that's ColdCase Christianity and God's crime scene, I needed to be able sometimes to make the case for why we ought to be making the case. And that's what Forensic Faith is. It's really the case for why we should be interested in making the case. And so, yeah, I hope that those kinds of books are the kind of thing you can absorb and then communicate to your pastor. But I think part of the problem, too, is that we have a system in place that puts incredible demands on pastors.
Yeah.
I mean, I've done that job. That job is no fun. Okay, that job is a lot of work. And it's almost no one ever, and for the most part, it's a lot of complaining. People complaining about why you're not doing it right.
Right.
And I'll tell you, I have a heart for folks who are committed to doing that, especially bivocationally, because, man, I don't know. You got to feel called by God to want to put up with all that nonsense. And there's a lot of nonsense that goes on in any church family. We get that.
Yeah.
So I give a lot of credit. And I do think what happens is it feels like probably to a lot of youth pastors and even parents, when we talk about this today, it feels like, are you really going to add another layer of stuff I got to do? Or another layer of stuff I got to know? Because if that's the case, I'm out. I'm already tapped out now. I can't add another thing to my plate. And that really, I think, sadly, is where a lot of pastors are with all the heavy lifting they're doing. Not every pastor's got a staff of 80 people who can help with all the nooks and crannies. A lot of times that's the same pastor who shows up at every funeral, at every sick bed, at all the relational stuff. Oh my gosh, we ask a lot of our pastors. So I know this is a hard ask so for me, it was just that's how I became a Christian. So I didn't know really any other way to teach it, any other way to talk about it, any other way to read through scripture with somebody, any other way to teach scripture, because I came to faith that way. It was the natural way that I would then communicate it to others. So you didn't have to convince me of the power of apologetics. I came to faith through the power of apologetics. So I knew that was the way I was always going to communicate it. And that's really the way I pastored. But what I learned in that is that this generation we're talking about right now, I've been working with high schools. The high schoolers that I was working with are all millennials. Okay, so that's been a little while, and now they're all raising their own kids, and they're all very young kids, and so that's pretty cool. But we spend a lot of time. Sean McDowell, who co-wrote the book with me, we spend a lot of time in front of high school audiences, and that really is what Gen Z is. It's that 3 to 20-ish range. If you've got a junior higher or a high schooler in your family, that is a Gen Z. And you might think, well, that's pretty young. Yeah, it is. But it turns out that the age of skepticism, where it used to be that 85% of Christians became Christians by the age of 18, and only a 15% margin became Christians after 18. That has now dropped to about 13, 12.
Wow. So
that means that and why is that happening? Because the skepticism is driven by the glowing rectangle. This is what's happened. What's happened is that you may not have even encountered another worldview until you were in college or a young person in the adult world back when my generation. But now you're encountering that kind of skepticism and all the worldview noise that is out there. You're encountering that now online at a much earlier age. So that's why we've said, hey, Gen Z, if you care about the future of the church, if you're looking at the statistics, at the characteristics of Gen Z, you ought to be concerned, because those are your kids, your grandkids, your nieces and nephews. That's the next generation of believers. And so it's, Psalm 78, really it's about saying, well, are we willing to pass this on so that the next generation will know and trust and put their confidence in God? So that's what we're trying to do here, and provide a very practical look. This is not a book that's going to teach you the Christian worldview. That's what ColdCase Christianity does. That's what God's Crime Scene does. That's what Forensic Faith does. This is a book that says if you know what's true, you're still going to struggle to teach it to the next generation because this generation has got a different set of characteristics that require us to teach in a slightly different way. And that's what we're trying to do with this book. This is not a what book. This is a how-to book on how to take the stuff you already know. Because look, I can tell, Stacy, you already have been exposed to a lot of good thinkers. You had Frank on your show. He's a good personal friend. Greg's a personal friend. These are people who that's the circle that I hang out with. And so if you've already, I bet you could teach apologetics right now. The question is, what approach would you take that would be different with Gen Z than you might do with my age group?
Yeah.
That would be two different approaches.
Yeah.
So I think that's what we're trying to talk about here.
Yeah, well, and Janet Parshall is actually my radio mentor of a decade or so. So, you know, when I found Janet, it was like, oh my gosh, there's a woman out there. And
I was just on her show, I think yesterday or the day before yesterday. Yeah, so I totally get that. Yeah.
I've had Nancy Piercy on my show. I actually endorsed Total Truth when she wrote that. So, so those are, you know, I've had a handful of Christian women on, but
what we discovered is people would come up to us afterwards and say, okay, I get it. This is something I want to learn more about for my own kids. But then they would ask, okay, but then do you have like a curriculum that I can just plug in? Something I can just, because I'm not sure how then to teach it. Like how do I break it down? Do I teach it in a certain order? Do I have that's what we knew was needed. We knew what was needed at this point was a how-to book, especially for people who are going to come in contact with Gen Z. And that's going to be parents, youth pastors, and Christian educators. So what we did is every chapter of the book, we're just trying to address those three groups and give you a tool in one of those three areas.
Can you go ahead and tell us the name of that book? Because you're talking about your latest book, right?
Yes, that's So the Next Generation Will Know.
Do you have a copy? I don't have a copy of that one. I don't get it.
No problem. I should have sent you a copy before we started. But, you know, that again, it all comes down to, well, look, I've written a lot about this for free on my website because we knew that we want to be able to give to have that information out there. But in the end, it's tough to dive deep into any content without having to write a book.
Yeah.
So that's where we are.
But do you have one like that you can hold up and show people?
Let's see. I believe I do.
Okay, cool. He can sign it on the air, autograph it to me.
The advanced reading copy. It looks like this.
Okay. Yeah.
So I'll put it here closer to my face so you can see it. Okay, there you go.
There it is.
So the Next Generation Will Know with Sean McDowell and I wrote this together. And the foreword is written by Nick Foles, the MVP of Super Bowl, the last Super Bowl before last.
Oh, cool.
And it turns out Nick is, he was with the Eagles at the time. He's now with the Jaguars, but he was with the Eagles then. And he's an interesting character in that here's a guy who's got everything and just signed a huge contract. He'll be starting with another NFL team. He's already been to the pinnacle, won it, and won the MVP of the game. Yeah, what is his most ambitious goal? It's to retire from the league and become a youth pastor.
That's cool.
And I thought that was something that was just really powerful because I think he gets it, right? So I will tell you, if I was going to go back into ministry again, I wouldn't lead pastor. I would youth pastor because it seems to me that's really where the action is. Mm-hmm. To be honest with you, if you're my age and you're a Christian, you're probably already, that's it. You've already decided you're there. But where the decisions are taking place, it turns out, are in junior high and in the first couple of years of high school. As a matter of fact, when young people are polled and asked in their college years, are you still a Christian? If they say, no, I'm not a Christian anymore, well, then we start asking, well, when was it that you first checked out? And do you know what they say pretty much consistently? 10 to 17. Mm-hmm. It's not when they go to college. It's while they're still with us in their junior high and high school years. That's when they're making a decision for Christ. And so that's why I think it's so important for us to master communicating to Gen Z. And they are different than any other generation, largely because they appeared at a time, a critical age change. Imagine being born at the beginning of the industrial age. And, your parents were still using horses and buggies, but suddenly there's this new thing called a car that's available. And now you can span distances very quickly. There was a change that took place. It took maybe a generation or two for us to really fully embrace that change. Well, we are in the midst of the information age, dawning of the information age. And this is the first full generation that has been born in that digital age.
Yes.
The smartphone changes everything. It's as revolutionary in terms of our culture as any other invention. So
yeah,
it's time for us to look at what makes that, what does that do to this next generation? How does it make them different?
yeah. Well, and I spent 3 years, I'm a trained marriage and family therapist, and part of my internship was actually spending 3 years at elementary school. Actually, it was California Elementary School in Costa Mesa. Actually, it was where I did my internship. And I worked with those children, from kindergarten through 6th grade. And I was stunned not only at how precocious they are, because they are, but I was stunned at the technology that they knew even then. Which is why I wanted to bring out, because I just discovered this. You actually have a mobile app, ColdCase Christianity.
Yes.
Your mobile app. So everybody, make sure you go to your Play Store and download it. It's super cool. Tell everybody what's on it, because I do everything on my phone. So when I saw that you had that app, I was like, yes, I have it. More weapon on my phone.
Yeah, a lot of it is you're trying to figure out, well, how can I take the digital content that's online? And look, a lot of our websites now, like the websites, in order to kind of to return well on search engines like Google, websites had to become responsive maybe about 2 or 3 years ago. When I say responsive, what I mean is the software is such that when you open them online, they are reformatted for this digital platform. So my website already reformats. So the question is, why would I even bother to make a phone app? Why should I do a phone app? The website kind of like is a phone app. Now it's responsive now. It changes for the phone. Well, no, phone apps are different. I mean, we have a specific purpose for phone apps, and that is to help you when you're in the midst of a conversation. And when I talked about this with Frank and I do a lot of events together, Frank Turek, and he would always say, if you have a phone app, you can tell somebody that when they ask you a tough question, hang on, I got a message here, and you check your phone, and you're actually on your phone app getting the answer to their question. Well, I thought, could we create a set of resources that would really do that? That would really be one paragraph addressing the 30 most common objections that are offered against Christianity. We call those quick shots. Well, the best place to put those is in a phone app, because if you're talking to somebody, you could literally step away from the conversation for 30 seconds and get the answer in one paragraph. And if you didn't feel comfortable like remembering it, fine. You can just read it to them and have the response in one paragraph. So those quick shots, we think, are worth the price of admission, but because the price is free. And the idea here is that we would provide that as a resource. And that's really what drives the content on the phone app. It's, can we provide resources that are so brief? And this is one of the things we discovered about Gen Z. It used to be that we would say that millennials had an attention span of about 11 seconds. Which, I can see, I don't think that's really unique to millennials. I think all of us, as we are conditioned by social media and conditioned by 140, now it's 280 characters, we have become impatient, visually impatient. We measure now the success of videos online by what? By how many seconds does somebody watch before they click away?
I know.
So I think that now for Gen Z, they're saying it's about 8 seconds. I think that's true. And especially if you watch old movies, and I always talk about, like, if you watch Gone with the Wind and a conversation is taking place in Gone with the Wind, well, that camera stays on that one person until he finishes his sentence.
Right.
Then it goes to her and she finishes her sentence. That is not the case now. You know what's going to happen. It's going to be him, and 4 seconds in, it's going to be her response to him over his shoulder, looking at her response over her shoulder, looking at him talking from the side. They're going to make 1,000 scene changes in the same conversation. Well, why? Because they realize that we are in a visually impatient culture.
That's even
we're not going to sit and listen to that whole conversation.
That's true. Even my husband, though, he doing this show, I mean, we're just doing 2 computers here, but he flips back and forth.
Right.
Because
you really need to do that? No, of course you don't. The whole thing could be the screen you're showing right now with 2 faces on the screen. The whole thing could be, why do we do that? Well, we do that, but he just did it again. So why are we doing that? Because we know that the attention span is, and it's not even that we're like necessarily thinking about our audience. As the creators, we're already visually impatient. Right. We are already making these changes. Now, what does that mean for communicating with Gen Z? I think it means that I've learned to turn corners. I also learned I have a sense of what would be the effective way to say this, because it's rhetorically powerful yet short. Sometimes what makes something rhetorically powerful is that it's short. So I think that that's one of the things I try to do now. I don't know if you've ever watched Frank Turek's answers, that Q&As that he does on college campuses, right? Mm-hmm. What I love about Frank is that he can probably answer almost any question in about 60 seconds. And he's learned that
That's
is really
good.
the attention span that people have. Number one, it gets you through a whole long list of people who are asking questions. But honestly, if you can't say it, and I'll tell you, I'm not as good at that as he is. Because I'm always thinking about, well, in front of the jury, I want to be thorough to the point where I preemptively talk about what the defense attorney is going to say next. So that works against me, though, in this kind of a setting, because what you really need is, what can I do in 30 seconds to stop this, end it, answer it, and move on? Because what happens is, I think the attention span of young people is shorter and shorter. And I think at some point it's like, okay, blah, 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 blah. So, I mean, you kind of say it and move on to the next thing.
You're making my job easy because I don't have to say much. All right. Hey.
Well, when you get an obsessive compulsive on your show, you can actually just sit back and just kind of watch.
Yeah, well, it's challenging, though, because I have a question and then I forget what it is. Oh, but anyway, in all seriousness, I have to take a break.
Okay.
But I do have some questions. I think our audience does, too. Hey, you guys, I hope you guys have questions. Hello? Or if you're like me, Janet Parshall always says it's one of these delicious conversations that you're just chewing it up, letting it digest, getting into your tummy, and eating it. And then you can share it when other people do that. But anyway, hey, here's what I want to remind you of right now. Our sponsor is Ariel Ministries. And I don't know if you know about Camp Shoshana, the School of Messianic Jewish Studies, but Dr. Arnold Fruchtenbaum and others will be teaching up there this summer, which, if you can go, you should go, because it's a great camp. And it's a break. And it's in the Adirondack Mountains, people. Yeah, it is. And they'll serve you food, and you'll have fellowship and worship. All you gotta do is go to campshoshana.com. You can learn more. The other thing we're doing currently is we are actually studying the book of 1 Peter, and next Wednesday, I think we'll be back to Wednesday. We did it this Tuesday because we had Jennifer on yesterday, but if you want to get Dr. Arnold Fruchtenbaum's teaching on that, you can go to ariel.org, and then you can go to the search box and search 1 Peter, and it will pop up, and then you can save 20% when you use the coupon code Bible News. Yeah, you can. And I hope you do. That way they know that you're from my audience. All right, people. All right. And don't forget, we also have the book, The Feasts and Fasts of Israel. This book right here. See, this book, it's hardcover. It's thick, it's heavy. You can use it as a weight and a doorstop when you're not reading it. Although I'm sure Arnold wouldn't appreciate that. He might. I don't know. Anyway, you can also save 20% on that when you use the coupon code Bible News. And don't worry, if you forgot all that, just go to my website, BibleNewsRadio.com. Go to the resources page, and then you can check out some of the other stuff that we have there. Now, I know yesterday Jennifer said I have pillagers of the community, but no, people, you guys are our pillars. You hold us up when you donate. So if you go to BibleNewsRadio.com/give, you guys can donate. I have also added Venmo as a receiving option for payment. If you want to donate through Venmo, now you can do that. Otherwise, it's PayPal or your credit card, or you can cut me a big check and send it to me in the mail. The address is on our website, okay? All right. And don't forget, one last thing. People, Jennifer got out of order yesterday on the show, as you know, mocking the host, teasing the world about me. Question is, will Jim get out of order today? If so, now he knows I am a lady of justice with LegalShield. You guys can go and you can learn more about LegalShield by going to bit.ly/LOJ2019, all caps, if you guys want to learn more about legal insurance and high-quality, world-class identity theft protection, which you should have. Okay, you can go there. Did I forget anything, Randall?
I think it pretty much covers it.
Is that it? Nailed it. All right, the gavel even helps. It's a memory tool.
I thought I'd put a face with the voice. I think that pretty much covers it.
Yeah, it does. Okay, anyway, so, hey, if you guys came in late on Periscope or YouTube, or if you're watching on the archive on Facebook or any of the podcasts that we have, our guest today is Mr. Jim Warner Wallace. Yeah, he is. He is a cold case homicide detective who's been featured on Dateline, Fox News, and True TV. A former atheist, he's the author of Cold Case Christianity and God's Crime Scene, and he has a master's degree in theology, lives in California with his wife and 4 children, and for the first time ever is on Bible News Radio, and I'm totally honored and super excited that he's still with us for the rest of the half hour. So, welcome back, Jim.
Glad to be here. Glad to be with you.
Well, I'm glad you're here. All right, I have a question. I'm going to look here over on Periscope. All right, Euromaster, if you have a serious question, go ahead and ask it, and I'll get to it after I ask my question. Okay, so one of the things that I encounter a lot online, and I'm sure you do too. I mean, you teach at Biola, so you teach a lot of young people, probably some old people too. Although I don't. How old are you? Do you mind me asking?
So I'm 57, but at Biola, we're teaching in the master's program. So usually these are master's students, and they're usually a little bit older.
Okay, I'm 50. I know. I don't look it, do I?
Not at all. I'm not going to get smashed by that gavel.
Hey,
so,
you know, I have a whole line of jokes with this that I could do.
I know better. Go ahead.
It's a short story. Anyway, you can buy these on Amazon. Did you know that?
Well, I mean, I've got more weapons I could pull out here if you want me to match your little silly gavel. I mean, give me a break. I'll pull out something to match your gavel. Okay. You would never bring a gavel to a gunfight, okay? It doesn't work.
I know, right? Who am I dealing with? That's right.
That's right.
Yeah, well, you are. I can't even imagine some of the stuff that you've seen. I don't even want to go there because I just...
Well, a lot of it's online. I mean, a lot of these things ended up on Dateline because I happen to live in a part of the country where Dateline was interested in a couple of our early cases. And then once those went well, they stayed with us and it's probably spent about 10 years with us doing a case every couple of years. So it was fun. But most of that stuff, it's amazing what you would necessarily feel comfortable talking about, say, 15 years ago, and what you're now comfortable. I mean, even fiction has become... I mean, with the rating system, I'm always amazed at I'm amazed at what commercials we are able to play on a show where you might be like a sporting event and it's at 4:00 in the afternoon. And some of these commercials, I'm like, wow, really? I'm surprised that's even, because kids are watching. I'm surprised they would put that on, but yeah.
Yeah. Okay, here's a question. Well, and I don't watch much TV actually, so I don't even have cable because I can't deal with it. Okay, so here's a guy, Euromaster. He asks, as a homicide detective in California, and with the 25th anniversary of the O.J. Simpson case this year, they want to know what your thoughts are on the trial and the aftermath. I guess that's a good question. It's 25 years already. Gosh.
I get asked that a lot. I usually try to stay out of it. I mean, I think that when we were first talking to the investigators from LAPD, I work in just south of Los Angeles in a municipal agency that's just south of LA. We have a LA on our border. So we know these guys personally, and we talked about, what was done well, what was not done well. I think what people learn, and this might be surprising to some people, but the reality of it is that you don't win cases in opening argument. I talk about this in Forensic Faith. You don't win them during the evidence show. You don't win them in opening statement, evidence show, closing argument, rebuttal. These are the typical steps and pieces that you have in any court trial. But it turns out you don't win an opening statement. You can make a rather robust opening statement. Sometimes we spend 2 hours, 3 hours in opening statement. Then you go through 6 weeks of the trial. Then you have a 3-hour, 4-hour closing argument. Then you have a rebuttal period. None of those things matter, though, if you don't do the first thing right, which is jury selection. Jury selection determines outcomes. It just does. And we take time to pick the right jury, making sure that we limit the number of people who might possess a bias that would affect their interpretation of evidence. Because remember, there's a difference between facts and inferences.
Yes.
So we can present the facts, but what you infer from those facts is a more complex journey that involves your desires, your backgrounds, your personal history, your tastes, your preferences, your wiring, how you're wired as a human being. What we're trying to do in jury selection is make sure we have people who might be on one side of the issue or the other, but they are reasonable. They're in that reasonable center. They're not at the extreme edges. And so I suspect a lot of what happened in the O.J. Simpson trial really starts in jury selection. And one of the things that Robert does well, Robert Shapiro, who I've been in trial with Robert Shapiro, we won our case, okay? But a lot of it that Robert tries to do is to first move the trial to a place where he has more control over the jury selection, because he knows that is true. And he did that with our trial too. He moved it downtown the same way he moved the OJ case downtown, where it could have been tried in Santa Monica. That would have been a very different jury pool.
Sure.
So the same thing is true where I am. That's one of the first steps you're going to make, right? And so that's what happens sometimes. But I never want to get into the strength or the weaknesses of how or performance, how an attorney does, how a detective does. You know, how that to me is available. It's probably the most documented trial in the history of trials. So everyone comes out of that knowing at least something about the strengths and weaknesses of the people who were involved. I don't need to kind of recite those, but I will tell you, I think the very first thing that we spend time on to make sure we have people on the jury who are not going to be a problem for us later because we didn't know well enough about who they were.
Yeah. Well, and I remember the one time I was called to jury duty and I was in there and I was so naive. I had no idea. You know, the defendant is sitting there as they're picking the jurors. Yes. And the judge asked me and the defendant guy asked me some questions and I just flat out said, the guy's guilty based on everything you just said. He's totally guilty. And they said, dismissed. And I was like, yeah, it was really, I wanted to, and I really wasn't trying to get dismissed, but you know, it was a sex offender case, and so I was just instantly like, you're guilty. And
right. Well, I can tell you were what I would call a 1. So a 1 is somebody who's so inclined toward the prosecution that no matter what we say or don't say, they're going to find this guy guilty. Okay. So we don't, the defense team does not want 1s. At the same time, we don't want 4s. Yeah. People who are so convinced that the police are corrupt and the system's corrupt that if this guy's here, he's probably been falsely accused. Okay, we want those guys off the team also. What we want are 2s and 3s. People who might be inclined toward the prosecution, but they're reasonable. Or people who might be inclined toward the defense, but they're reasonable. Both will they're willing to suspend their bias or suspend their presuppositions long enough to do justice to the case. And we realize that everyone is on that spectrum somewhere. We get that. We're just trying to remove the edges. And this is also true for those of you who are trying to share your faith, because there are people on that same spectrum and who you're trying to communicate to. If you're a 1, you're somebody who's so committed to Christianity that you don't even care if it's true. It's working for you. Well, okay, you might think, I don't even need to make a case to that group. Now, if you're a 4, you're so adamantly opposed to Christianity that no matter what I say or post on Twitter, you're going to find some way to say something vile in response to it. Well, I don't really do much with 1s and 4s. I don't need to do much with 1s, and 4s aren't listening. I'm looking for 2s and 3s, people who are starting to have doubts or maybe have some skeptical questions. And by the way, Gen Z are far more likely to be 2s and 3s than they are 1s. So that means we're going to have to spend some. So if you think, well, I'm a 1 and I already know this is true and I don't need to know what the evidence is, you don't need to make a case for me. Really? Do you have kids?
No.
Because if you have kids, those are 2s or 3s.
At least where I'm coming from.
And by the way, they don't want to hear from you and me. Well, they don't want to watch our shows or read our books. They want to hear from mom and dad.
It's actually true because, I was probably a 1 when that jury thing, happened. Just so you know, that was like 20 something years ago. I've mellowed out since then. Right. Hard to believe.
Right. So that's why maybe now we would impanel you in a way, and before we wouldn't have.
Well, now I wouldn't speak my mind that way. I would hold back. I wouldn't just.
Okay, so you're actually more difficult now, because what happens is, for both sides, is we know there are some people who are in the 1 and 4 category, but who are trying to look like they're 2s and 3s. So what we do now is we actually have surveys that are far more robust. Now, we're also going to do the interview, that voir dire process. We're going to do that. But before you get up there to ask those questions, you've already completed surveys for us. So we've had a weekend probably to search through all of the surveys. And we already know something about those 70 people before they ever get up on the stand to ask a question.
So kind of like
why we're doing that is to try to uncover, the deeper hidden.
So it would be kind of like the MMPI where you'd have the lie detector installed in there.
Yeah.
So you'd be able to look and see if the person lied or not, right? Is that what you're saying?
Well, I'm sure both sides would love to use something like that,
Yeah,
but we're not quite there yet. But yeah, but we try to at least kind of dig out the things that are obvious, right? So
Yeah. Okay, well, I did have another question, but you actually answered it. And the other guy that you answered his other question said he liked your answer. But I have a question. And
Okay.
my question concerns a lot of people. You're talking to a skeptic. I wasn't raised in a Christian home, actually. I became a believer in high school. And the reason I love apologetics and got involved in apologetics so early on is because my brother, to this day, who's 54, almost 55, to this day, he is still, like, not a believer. He's one of these ones that has a gazillion doubts. He's hardened, right? Yeah. And, and then I heard somebody on Facebook a little while ago, there was this conversation going on about the Satanic Temple. And I think it was Liz, one of my friends on Facebook, posted this article about how the Satanic Temple advocates basically in defense of Planned Parenthood because it's their religion to support everything Planned Parenthood does. And the person, I don't know if it was the person that posted it, but the rebuttal that came up had to do with, well, how, why do Christians find this evil? Because this is our religion, and we're reasonable, And her response was Isaiah 5:20, basically calling abortion evil. And they were basically saying, well, no, it's not, who are you to say that our religion is evil when we're giving aid and comfort to women in distress, referring to Planned Parenthood. And then one of the responses came up, well, this is exactly why I left Christianity, and you guys aren't Christians, and you're blah, 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 blah. So how do you deal with that type of rhetoric when people they're so emotional, but they won't listen to reason?
Well, I think what you try to do is do what Greg would teach us to do, right? You're asking really good questions to mine out the inconsistencies in people's views. All of us embrace some views that we think are transcendent. Even if your view is that morals are really a matter of personal opinion, you believe that view about morality applies to both you and me. So you believe there's a transcendent view, a transcendent truth about morality, that morality is actually personal. And I know that sounds kind of counterintuitive, but everyone believes that there are some universal, transcendent, objective moral claims. Really, all that's left is for us to figure out which claims are objective and transcendent and which claims are personal. Are there ever objective, transcendent moral claims? I think that's why we try to supersize this and say, look, I don't think anyone would agree, would say that it's okay to torture babies for fun.
Right.
How do you justify the torturing of babies and say, well, I'm having fun doing it? That I don't think anyone would say that is a morally virtuous act. That is one act that we could say transcends every people group. Now, if people torture babies, yes. But do they do it for fun? No, we would call those people sick. If there's an individual who's torturing babies for fun, we would say something is broken in his moral compass.
Right.
People may have sacrificed babies to appease a god in primitive times, but that wasn't for fun. They thought they were actually achieving some of their greater end.
Right.
We would agree that wasn't a greater end. But the point is, when you just add the expression for the fun of it to the end of any moral act, you will find it's objective, transcendent, moral, absolute. It's never okay to kill people for the fun of it. You might justify a homicide, and we often do. We have to, and so unfortunately. It's never okay to lie for the fun of it. You might be able to justify it for some greater end, fine, but for the fun of it? To steal for the fun of it? Just add for the fun of it, and you now have discovered the objective, transcendent, moral, absolute. So look, we all agree these things are out there. The only question is killing another human without proper justification okay? Now, what they're going to argue is, well, we have whatever's justifying their doing it is what is necessary to justify it. We would say, well, actually, no. There's only two things that would justify the killing of a human. One, to protect your own life.
Right.
This is in Scripture. This is also, though, in every penal code on every state of America. Forget about Scripture. It's also a secular value that's held. or to protect the lives of an innocent. So if somebody has to shoot a gunman on a schoolyard who is killing 5-year-olds one after the other, you would find that killing justifiable because you're protecting the lives of innocents. These are two ways that every state in the United States justifies the act of killing another human.
Yes.
Okay. It's never okay, though, to kill a human for the fun of it.
Right.
So the question is, are those two moral justifications present in this act in which you are suggesting it's okay to kill another human? Now, of course, the bigger question is, what is it? Is it a human?
Right.
Now, once you make the case for that it's a human, well, then the question is, do you have proper moral justification? Forget about Christianity for a second. Would you have proper moral justification given the laws of your own state? Forget about whether they say abortion is legal. I'm talking about the justifiable homicide laws in that state, because I think we're confused about this.
Sure.
We would say it's okay in California to have an abortion, yet we charge the second homicide if you kill a woman who's pregnant.
Right. Mm-hmm.
Okay, so we got to figure this out, because we can sometimes have contrary laws that make it hard to understand where we land on this. So for me, it's all going to come down to, look, we both agree on something. We agree that there are objective, transcendent moral laws. The only question is, what are the laws that apply to this act? So I think I want to start on what our common ground is first. But also remember, if you're talking to someone who's a 2 or a 3, you've got an opportunity to make headway. But if you're talking to someone who's a 4, it's like you might as well be talking to the wall.
Right.
So I want to quickly identify first in my conversation, who am I talking to here? So on social, by the way, and I won't have these conversations online.
I actually didn't. I was tagged in the conversation. I did not engage in it. I just read it.
So people tag me all the time. Let me tell you what I do. If it's on Twitter and you tag me in a conversation I have not initiated, I will mute you. And I'll never hear another time you ever tag me on anything, because you've now been muted.
Yeah.
On Twitter. Well, why? Because first of all, there's a certain etiquette. If you want to talk to me first and ask if I can get involved in a conversation, I'll tell you yes or no. But if you're just going to tag me to drag me in, well, trust me, I could do like 15 of those a day.
Sure.
There's no time for that. And also, it's not polite. Don't drag me in unless I ask to be dragged in. So that, I think, is part of it. Okay. So I'll just tell you that up front. But if I go over to their site and I discover by looking through their feed that they are really vulgar. They don't even have their own. They don't even use their own picture on their Twitter feed. They've got some name like God hater is their name. On Twitter. Look, I can pretty quickly figure out they're in the category 4.
Right.
And if they're in category 4, there's no point in conversation here. They're really trying to drag me into something so I can be the whipping boy for what they want to do as a category 4. Well, look, it's not that I love the idea that people are out there. I was one of those guys. I was a category 4, so I get it. But at the same time, we have to be effective in our conversations, and it's about jury selection. Who am I going to have this 6-week trial with? Who am I going to have this conversation with? I don't do it with 1s and 4s. I focus on 2s and 3s. There
you go. Great answer. All right. So one last question, because we are almost done. Can you believe it? This time with me went by so fast, didn't it? Yeah, it did.
It did go by fast, yeah.
Okay, that was a bad joke, but whatever. Hey, occasionally they fall flat. Whatever. Hey, okay,
well, so listen, this is why I never tell. Frank Turek tells jokes.
I know.
I work with Frank all the time, and he is a comedian. I'm telling you, that guy is hilarious. But I have learned that I am not him.
I know.
I'm not funny.
Clearly.
So I just try to, just stay in your lane. I stay in my lane.
Okay, so I'm going to bring up a hot topic, but you don't have to weigh in if you don't want. But recently, unfortunately, Rachel Held Evans died. Mm-hmm. Right? I'm sure you heard about that. And I bring her up because I think she is a example of some of the current debate within the church on the topic, not only of womanhood and all that, but also on the issue of homosexuality and the way that some people in the church have actually embraced that as an acceptable behavior in the church. And, I talk about this all the time on our show because I kind of was indirectly dragged into the arena years ago, and I've become kind of an expert on it, but I want your take on how do we engage people on that hot topic, especially when you have people like Rachel, who made big inroads with a big part of the church, which frankly I didn't agree with her on anything, but but still remain respectful.
Well, I think what you do is, I saw your video, the first part of it at least, of the show you did on Rachel, and I thought that you did a great job of remaining rational and compassionate about. Look, it's tragic, right?
Thank you.
Anytime a 37-year-old.
Can I say something?
Yeah.
That was highly intentional. So I really appreciate you saying that, because that was my goal. And I told Randall ahead of time, I said, look, I want to talk about this, but I don't want to come off as one of the right-wing conservatives that bash her or anything.
Yeah, and I've seen it online. I mean, I've seen that kind of response online dealing with her. But I'll just tell you, I don't know. I'm not as familiar with her work verse by verse and line by line as other people are. So I really can't plumb all the levels of where she may have been theologically correct or theologically incorrect. But I do think that ideas matter and theology matters. So I always struggle a little bit with this, and I'll tell you where I struggle with it. I struggle with it because it's clear that you're saved by grace, and whatever your position is in terms of what it is you believe that Jesus did for you, wherever you see yourself in your need for a Savior, how you have trusted Christ to do for you what you cannot do for yourself. We already get that. But it's also clear, if you read, if there was no book in 1 John or no Matthew 7:21, I would be okay with all of it. But because there are, it's also clear that a lot of people will come and try to do good things in the name of Christ and say they are Christians and identify as Christ followers. Yet you can say you love me, John says, but if you don't do what I tell you to do, if you don't do what I say, if you don't believe what I'm saying, if you reject the moral teaching of Jesus of Nazareth, you are rejecting Jesus of Nazareth. So I don't know if she did that or not. I don't know much about Rachel Held Evans, except that I hear the name. I've never read any of her work, so I can't comment on that. But I'm just saying that I also struggle with, where is that line? We know that it's faith alone, apart from works, that saves you, so no one can boast. We get that. But what kind of faith? Is it a faith that ultimately submits and produces the kind of works that are consistent with the claims of Jesus? Now, the problem with that, of course, is, well, how quickly do you slip into a works theology then?
Right.
So we're really kind of struggling with that, right? And I get that. And that's something that I'm going to I got lots of questions for God when I get there. But I do know that when I'm making a decision about what is right to do in the world, I have to run it through the filter of Jesus first, through the filter of Scripture first. If the teaching is clear on a topic, even though I may disagree with it, I have to bend my knee to the teaching of Scripture. I cannot say, well, maybe in the context of that. No, look, we have to do our best to do proper hermeneutics and then build a cumulative case from Scripture, not trusting on just one passage out of context, but building it cumulatively on the lines of several lines of biblical evidence before we make decisions about the moral teaching of Jesus of Nazareth. And then once we get there, although we may not like it, we've got to decide, am I a Christ follower or not?
Right.
I've got to follow the clearest and most reasonable inferences I can make about the teaching of Jesus to be a Jesus follower. So I think to the degree to which and I also think that if we're going to lead people astray from the teaching of Jesus, stand by. That's not pretty. Now, unfortunately, or maybe fortunately for this conversation, I don't know enough about her teaching to know where she stood on any of these issues. I'm actually learning more about her now after her death than I ever knew about her. I mean, this is just not one of those areas that I'm not a discernment ministry.
Ouch.
What we're really making is an evidential case for the actual historicity and of theology and the truth of the deity of Christ and the reliability of Scripture. I stay in my lanes there. I do talk about things like abortion because people will ask me, well, when is a homicide justified? That's been my whole life's work.
Right.
So yes, I'm going to talk about those issues, but I try to stay in my lane on other issues because why should you care what Jim Wallace says? Unless, of course, you're trying to assemble an evidential case for Christianity, then I hope you'll pay attention to me a little bit because I happen to know what it is to assemble evidential cases to come to a reasonable inference. That's what I do for a living. But in this case, I would just say that I thought you handled it well. I think that what I want to be is compassionate. I try not to divide my audience. I want the gospel to be heard, especially in places where I don't agree with my audience. So I go on shows that you might say, why in the world would you go on that show?
Oh.
Well, I'm on that show because I know that audience needs to hear this evidential approach to Christianity. By the way, I don't argue about politics because I always say this. If I argue about the foundational things, is the Bible true and should we take it seriously? Here's what I mean.
Right.
Number one, do we even believe that the Bible is true? I think someone like Rachel probably, I'm sure, believed the Bible was telling her the truth. I don't know much about her, what her claims are. Let's assume, though, that for the sake of argument, that she believes the Bible is true. The next question is, are you willing to take it seriously enough not to cherry pick the verses and twist it into something you want for your own life, but to take it seriously enough to say, hey, I've got to build the case based on biblical lines of evidence only. It turns out if we all believed the Bible was true and took it seriously like that, we would be divided on a very small number of issues. We spend a lot of time over here arguing about the issues, when in fact, if we would do this first foundational work, we would end up in the same place on lots of moral issues because we take the Bible seriously. We believe it's telling us the truth. And when someone asks us to support our case, our view, we try to support it from biblical evidence. We take it that seriously. So again, I have no idea where she lands on all those issues, but that's what I struggle with is it, because I always will say, well, look, so I can disagree about, if we disagree about essentials, for example, could you be a saved Christian if you rejected the deity of Christ? I'm trusting Jesus for my salvation. I really am. Where do we draw the line? Are there any Christian essentials at all? Or can I just make that first step, as primitive as it is, without even knowing any Christian essentials? There's a part of me that says the thief on the cross probably does not know a lot of Christian essentials.
Right.
Right. So there's that side of me. There's also the other side of this in 1 John. You read 1 John, I feel like dirt. Whenever I read 1 John,
that's my
I feel
favorite
like dirt,
book.
Right? I wonder if I'm saved sometimes reading 1 John, okay? Because I feel like, hey, this is a high bar.
I read it today on my Instagram story.
Yeah, so I mean, a lot of this is really, and that's why I think we owe it to ourselves. By the way, this is a great conversation to have. For me, as a sports fan, this is happening right in the middle of NBA playoffs.
Sure.
And I am, the fact that we are excited about having a serious question, a serious conversation about theology, because I'll tell you, most of us in America are having these kinds of passionate conversations about everything other than the theology. So the fact that we're willing to work through these issues and be able to make a case, well, what about this verse? And what about that verse? And we're going back and forth on biblical evidence. I wish everyone would do that.
Well, and that's, for me, that's the fun of doing the show every day. Because, I've been doing this for 15 years. And I listen to Janet for about, close to 15 years every day for 3 hours. It's kind of my calling and in my blood. But at the same time, it is a challenge because I'm a very compassionate person. I cry easy. I'm at that age anyway where I cry. But I'm also very rational and logical. Mm-hmm. And I look at the evidence and I go, okay, I don't understand how you don't see this, It's like, how come you don't see this, And that's where I think that, we have an opportunity as a society, frankly, a culture as a whole, because, we have a hot-headed culture, and I think it's very fueled by the media in general, to actually go out there and be reasonable and, have reasonable faith, to quote another book. But at the same time, also deal with children and help them out, because I see the little kids that I teach, and they wrote this, they can quote scripture like left and right, but they have no clue what it means.
That's right.
They have no clue. It's like, okay, and so this is where I try to challenge my audience by going, okay, look, 1 John is an example. We always take 1 John 1:9 totally out of context. If you look at verses 8 and 10 and look at that in context, just using the subject of homosexuality just as a mere example, if we say that this isn't sin, then the truth isn't in us, and we call
That's
God a
right.
liar. So
That's right.
we need to have, that understanding, because it makes so
Yeah.
much more sense. And we wouldn't do it with any other book. We wouldn't do it with a newspaper.
I
Why
know.
do we do it with the
By
Bible?
the way, is it okay for us as Christians to say, well, look, I don't even like the fact that this is, because I have people in my life who are members of different communities that I love.
Yeah.
And I'll tell you, is it okay for me to hate the fact that this is just true and I'm going to submit to it? And I don't like it sometimes on a number of issues. I wish I tell you, just my own anger. I'm more of a judgment guy. When you're in law enforcement, I'm sorry, you call us to the party because you want us to break it up. You don't call us there to celebrate with you. You call us there because there's something bad is happening. So law enforcement personnel like me, we have a real issue with justice and probably less likely to be merciful.
Right.
But I know I've got to constantly balance these two.
Right.
There are times when I don't like even the commands for mercy, for me to be merciful. I don't even like those. But am I still willing to submit to what's true? Even though I think maybe for me, I'm like, hey, this is justified anger on my part. Well, am I willing to submit even those smaller issues? Well, I think we have to realize that this life is going to be a lot, if you're a Christian, of saying, hey, I'm either all in or I'm all out. I can't cherry pick this out and take out things I think I like and things I think would work better in this generation than they would. No, I got to teach the whole counsel of God. Well, that puts you in a place where sometimes you're going to be uncomfortable because if you, I sense it. All of us want at some point to be embraced and to be accepted. But there are going to be times, this is not a life of embrace and accepted. This is, Jesus told us up front. As a matter of fact, if you find that you're embraced and accepted by the culture, you're probably doing something really wrong.
Right.
Because what you should expect, on the other hand, is complete rejection, because your views, if they mirror Jesus's, will lead you to a cross of your own. And that's really where we're stuck, right? So I think what I want to be is faithful in a culture that I don't know that I can change. So am I willing to be faithful in a cultural defeat? Yeah, I am. And so I don't expect that, hey, this is only true if it wins. This is true if it wins or it loses. And I'm okay. I'm comfortable in the loss, a cultural loss, because in the end, we know how the book ends. So I'm comfortable in a momentary temporal setback, because that's all it could ever be if Christianity is true.
That's right. Well said. And
All
I know
right.
that we could go on forever, but we can't, because my husband's like, would you wrap this up already?
Wrap it up, baby. Let's do it.
So go ahead. Tell everybody your website, your last book, your other books, and all that stuff.
Yep. So it's at ColdCaseChristianity.com. And if you go there, you'll see I've got all of our resources. All the books are there. But more importantly, we try to post something 5 days a week that'll help you take a step that you can then transfer to your kids. Everything we post, we think, is accessible to high schoolers. And that's why we write it that way. That's why we make the case that way. That's why we stayed in that detective lane, because the analogies we make in law enforcement and detective work, I think, will help communicate Christianity to the next generation. And our new book is So the Next Generation Will Know. And I was at a show today where someone said, you can find it at your local bookstore. Are there local bookstores? I don't think there are anymore. Just go to Amazon. Let's face it, they've kind of won the battle of digital media. So we are at Amazon's a good place to find our books.
Okay, I just got to ask you one last question.
Yeah.
Who is your favorite TV detective?
It's hard for me, right? Because I honestly hate TV detectives. So it's really hard for me to think of one that I really think is great. And there's a bunch that are out there. I don't watch any of them. I hate to say that, but
I'll tell you mine.
I don't. The best character who's probably close, it represents my own skeptical view of anything, is House, the doctor who's the diagnostician who that series has been off the air for a number of years. But I did like that character because in many ways, the way he diagnosed diseases was as skeptical. His tagline was always that everyone lies. So whatever they're telling you about this, they're lying about something. You get to the lie, you get to the diagnosis. And that's kind of how we approach the world as well. So if there's somebody out there in TV land that I think is a good character, written well, I think it is House.
That's awesome. Inch high, private eye.
There you go.
There you go, right there. I couldn't resist. All right, everybody. Hey, you know what? I have to tell you, this is the end of the show. Yeah, it is. So remember, as I always say at the end of every show, be bold, stand up, and go with God, because he loves you. We'll see you tomorrow.